Thank you so much, Bryce. All right. So next up, Siddharth Narayanan. Siddharth is research scientist at Future House, where he develops systems to automate the scientific method, specifically in the context of biological research. He's worked with scientific reasoning models and language agents for literature research and molecular cloning. He has a PhD in experimental particle physics from MIT, with a dissertation in dark matter searches at the Hadron Collider. Siddharth, excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Gonzalo, and thanks to Dunya for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. Cool. So I was asked to give an overview of the state of AI and science today and future directions. And so I thought, well, maybe I should first try to cover the breadth of research that's being done. I used at Future House, we have language research agents, and so I asked one of them to come up with a broad review paper style document for me to start with, covering the space of research that's being done at the moment. This is roughly what it came back with as a table of contents, and so I decided to give up on this approach of trying to cover everything. There's just simply too much work to cover in a 15-minute talk. And this is maybe one of the points I want to make right out of the gate, which I think a few people have made already today, is that AI for science isn't a nascent field. It's an actively used field. It's a field that researchers use essentially in every domain that I can think of across pretty much every part of the scientific method. And so the question these days is, how do we exploit this more than how do we start getting our foot in the door? And so instead, I'm going to focus the topic a little bit more on not just covering all scientific applications, but try to talk specifically about how we try to use AI for the scientific method, the execution of the scientific method, as opposed to all applications that one can consider in science. And instead of, that still remains far too broad, and so instead of trying to cover all of that, I'm going to focus on a handful of recent examples that I think are interesting and also illustrative of the kinds of directions that people are trying to push things in, especially in the context of fundamental research. So we'll start by going through 3 examples of current applications. But before we do that, I want to try to frame things a little bit in the context of what I mean by the scientific method and how AI can be relevant. This certainly isn't a comprehensive framing, and there will be things that don't fall into these 2 buckets. But I think quite a lot of the work that's being done these days either falls into the category of trying to predict the outcome of an experiment, either because these experiments are extremely difficult to run or expensive, or just sometimes impossible, things like counterfactuals, or predicting the future evolution of a climate system, or predicting or proposing a specific hypothesis, experiment, or protocol to execute. You can think this is like roughly carving the scientific method in half, right? Number 2 asks the question, what should I do? And number 1 answers the question, what happens if I do that? Things like AlphaFold fall into predicting the outcome of an experiment. One can certainly go and measure crystallographically or using cryo-EM the structure of a protein. That's expensive and difficult. Instead, one can ask AlphaFold to give you an approximate prediction. Things like literature research I would also put into this category, right? Retrieving information from published research to try to predict, either through interpolation or through retrieval, the outcome of a particular experiment or scientific question. On the other side, we have probably what most of us as scientists do on a day-to-day basis is try to think up of the questions that we should be asking next. Hypotheses and experiments may seem kind of narrow and don't cover a large fraction of the research that's being done, but I would challenge that even things like small molecule diffusion models, things that people use to try to design binders for proteins, fall into this category because the molecule that is being designed by a diffusion model, like in this case, is itself a hypothesis, right? You have this question of whether a particular molecule can bind to a protein in a particular pocket. The model gives you a hypothesis of how it may pose itself if it were experimentally synthesized and co-located, and that's a hypothesis that needs to be experimentally validated, but is a hypothesis that we can explore more efficiently using AI systems. More traditionally, there are things like Google's recent co-scientists that produce what we might consider more traditional hypotheses, things like mechanistic interpretations of how gene regulatory networks might work. These still need to be experimentally validated, but give us a starting point that we can work with. So in the next few slides, I'll go through 3 examples of, I think, what is interesting work in these domains. The first one, I didn't coordinate with Bryce, but that was a nice coincidence, is trying to use machine learning surrogates for DFT calculations for materials discovery. So a common approach is to start with a very large space of potential materials that might satisfy the criteria you're interested in, let's say for catalysis or batteries. This large space of materials is usually theoretically or somehow combinatorially explored, in that they're not all known to exist, they're not all known to be synthesizable, and you certainly don't know whether the properties you're interested in are satisfied by these particular compounds. Now, one can certainly go through and try to synthesize all of them and then validate these properties, but that is prohibitively expensive. And so typically what is done is what's known as virtual screening, where you run this through some sort of in silico calculation that can tell you these properties, or at least approximate them, before you go and actually try to conduct the expensive experiment. Historically, this started off by using density functional theory to try to approximate the quantum mechanical ground state that you would actually realize in the laboratory. But even that, as Bryce alluded to, can be computationally quite prohibitive, even though data sets have gotten larger and larger over the years. And so over the last, decade or so, there's been a lot of work in what are known as machine learning interaction potentials trained on this DFT data basically to approximate it, so that we have coarser but faster approximations that we can use earlier on in this funnel. So 2 things, two examples of this I'd like to highlight. Here on the left is some recent research from a Finnish group where they essentially observed that modern universal MLIPs, things that can generalize to large categories of compounds, have gotten reasonably close to DFT approximations when it comes to asking about the vacancy formation energy, basically the energy involved in removing a particular atom or multiple atoms from a lattice. So here we just have the DFT prediction on the x-axis and the MLIP prediction on the y-axis. So then using this approximation, what they're able to do is explore this combinatorial space more efficiently. They start with large lattices, and then they just go through and remove atom by atom, atoms from the lattice, and see whether the resulting compound is stable. They start with stable compounds, so they just try to see whether the stability is preserved, and the properties that they're interested in arise. They take this so far as to be able to take 3D molecules, basically 3-dimensional lattices, and slice out entire layers that are predicted to be stable when in a 2D conformation. Again, applicable across areas like battery design, catalysis, and other material discovery domains. However, all of that is still in silico, right? All they've shown is that machine learning potential approximates a DFT calculation, but there's still the additional, reasonably well, but there's still the additional jump of being able to bring this to the real world and confirm that the predictions are usable and valid. This more recent work attempts to try to correlate this by looking at high energy oxides, where high entropy oxides, where many applications, finding an oxide that has only one phase, a single phase, is particularly important. So these green dots and red X's are the cases where the single phase state is found and the multi-phase state is found, the undesirable case. The X and Y axis are MLIP predicted quantities. And what's important to observe here is that basically using the MLIP predicted quantities, one can carve up the phase space in a way that predicts or correlates with the empirically observed result of whether it's a single phase or a multi-phase material. And so this gives a sense that one can start using these sorts of methods to try to screen not only for single predictions like the vacancy energy, but higher order properties in silico before having to go and experimentally synthesize these compounds. Moving on from predictors to things that can propose hypotheses or experiments, I'd like to take a look at proposing mathematical proofs. This might seem a little odd in the context of science, and so I guess an open debate of whether math counts as a scientific discipline. But I think mathematical proofs are actually a really good example of hypothesis generation and verification. Right? Until a proof is actually validated, it technically is a hypothesis for a way in which to prove a theorem. And it's a good playground for considering AI systems for hypothesis generation, because proofs, thanks to the work of automatic proof systems like Lean, are automatically verifiable. Right? In a lot of science, when you come up with a hypothesis in order to validate whether you got it right or wrong, you'll have to go and test the thing. And that's computationally difficult and can make it difficult for us to understand whether we're actually able to optimize systems, AI systems, against the validity of a proof, or against the validity of a hypothesis. But with mathematical proofs, we can test these systems in this setting and measure things like scaling laws, like the number of data points we need to be able to train an agent. And so a group at Caltech took this idea and developed what they called Lean Agent. Lean is one of these automatic proof assistant languages and systems. And they came up with an LLM-based system that can take a proof, or a theorem rather, which is encoded in Lean in these first few lines. It's basically a formalized language to encode mathematical statements, and generate proofs, shown here in green, that satisfy these theorems. The Lean agent is trained in a kind of a curriculum style, where it starts with the simplest problems first and gradually builds its way up to more and more complex problems. And as it does that, it can go back or rely on solutions that it found for simpler problems in order to solve more complex problems. Very similar to the way that mathematical researchers work, right? Human mathematicians don't prove everything from axioms every single time. They rely on theorems and lemmas that have been previously shown and build up higher order theorems and lemmas. And so it's quite nice to see an AI system benefit from similar curriculum learning. They then took Lean Agent and a few other language models and tried to come up with what they call the Lean Copilot, a human AI interface that allows mathematicians to work in tandem with AI systems. When they basically deployed it very similar to like a coding copilot in the Lean IDE, and then they asked a bunch of mathematicians to go through and prove a handful of mathematical statements, none of which are quite research level, things that research mathematicians should be able to prove on their own, with the addition of Lean Copilot. And in particular, what they found is that when the mathematicians were given access to search proofs, which is basically the full implementation, they found that up to 2/3 of the theorems were just proved fully autonomously. The human mathematician wasn't involved. And even in cases when the human mathematician had to actually write out a few statements line by line or direct the system, still about 3/4 of the final steps were from the AI system itself. So it's not quite at the level of a fully automated research level mathematician, but getting closer and closer there, and to the point where if I were writing a piece of software and GitHub Copilot wrote 75% of my code for me, that's a significant productivity boost. And so we're getting close to there, at least on the mathematical side of hypothesis generation. These things don't have to be done in isolation, right? You don't have to just have a system that only proposes things or just a system that only validates or predicts properties. You can put those two things together. One of the most mature domains for combining these things is protein design, largely motivated by two factors, right? The space of amino acid sequences is quite large, combinatorially huge, if you're considering proteins that are between 100 and 300 amino acids. So that makes things like virtual screening, pure virtual screening, very difficult to do because the space is huge. And on the flip side, predicting or measuring properties of these proteins is again difficult because you have to actually synthesize these things and do things like crystallography or binding assays to actually do things like measure the ability of a protein to bind to another protein. And so ML-driven surrogates for those things are extremely effective in this domain. And so all three of these results are from different groups. They used a generative model to handle the search problem, basically trained on a bunch of observed proteins so that they had good priors, and then used various machine learning surrogates for experimental validation that they could close the loop on with the generative model in order to iteratively optimize the generative model to optimize for various things like antibody binding efficiency, protein stability, and the foldability and diversity of proteins. These two were done entirely in silico, right? It's entirely possible for these kinds of closed loop systems to just run off the rails and effectively hack the reward model, to borrow a phrase from RL, where the predictor is pushed significantly out of distribution, and this doesn't correlate well with reality. The one on the left, this is from a group in Genentech, is particularly cool because they actually included a lab in the loop to be able to do this. So actually measuring binding affinity is, again, computationally challenging, but also experimentally very expensive. And so what they did here was at every iteration, they took a handful of lead candidates, experimentally synthesized them, measured a bunch of properties, including stability and eventually binding affinity, and used those to iteratively optimize the generative model, as well as the property predictors that were used in each stage of optimization. It's very likely that that will remain an important part of the loop, having the lab in the loop, instead of just relying on property predictors, especially in cases where the search space can be massive and we don't have good guarantees on the coverage of our property predictors. So that hopefully gives a little bit of like an illustrative coverage of the kind of work that's being done in the space. Almost certainly I haven't covered everyone's favorite paper because there's just too much to cover. But what I'll try to do in the next few slides is then just quickly gloss over what I think are some of the major open challenges that are only now starting to be addressed at scale, either due to technological advances or the realization that these are important challenges. So the first is, in many complex domains, including biology, which is where I've recently primarily been doing my work, is the need for like system-level world models, right? The property predictors I talked about earlier, one can think of as like extremely local world models, right? If I go and mutate a protein in a particular way, what happens to its stability? Does it go up or down? But being able to go to system levels, like things at the cellular level or multi-scale levels, is still a massive open challenge. In the context of like trying to come up with a binder for a protein, right? I can certainly use something like AlphaFold multimer to predict whether this thing will bind to it or not. But in the context of then figuring out whether that binder affects the pathway that I care about and moves it in the right direction, that requires a multi-scale model. And so there's been a large amount of work in trying to come up with what are known as multi-scale virtual cells, either fully black box or possibly interpretable systems that do model a cell at multiple scales and modalities, so that we can do things like ask, if I put this cell in a particular disease state in a bath of a particular drug, what happens to its expression profile? What happens to its protein expression and its transcriptomic state? A huge amount of this work starts with trying to accumulate the data that's needed in order to be able to train systems like this, because cells and many other complex systems live in extremely high dimensional spaces, and we historically have sampled extremely sparse parts of this space, right? People go after the disease states that are particularly interesting or the perturbations that are particularly interesting, and not a uniform sampling of the space that cells can occupy. But very recently, actually this last one is I think from a week ago, people have been coming up with large data sets that try more uniformly to sample the space of cells and perturbations so that virtual cell models can be trained. An important stepping stone to this, which I kind of glossed over earlier, but is actually kind of sits under many of the things I've talked about today, is coming up with high-quality multimodal representations. A lot of these systems, especially when they leverage large-scale data in order to be able to make their predictions or proposals, implicitly or explicitly rely on good representations that are built out of large-scale data. Another area of work is moving out of the space of optimization towards multi-step inference, or trying to bring both into play. This is a nice tweet from, actually don't know who this person is, but someone talking about a discovery that Trace Neuro made, I think last year. And the kind of multi-step process that the researchers had to go through in order to come up with their target, and eventually the drug to target it. This kind of multi-step reasoning cannot be covered by any of the approaches I've talked about today, right? This involves not only being able to do things like automatically analyze data and propose useful experiments, but also be able to do multi-hop reasoning, scientific reasoning, the kind of thing that human scientists spend years learning how to do in order to be able to make this inference. This is an open problem. Maybe it's an optimization problem with extremely sparse reward signals. Maybe it's not an optimization problem that we need to consider in a different way. It's very much an open question. To briefly plug my colleagues' work here, at Future House we've developed a system called Robin. It attempts to try to tackle this kind of a problem by doing its reasoning in natural language, and it proposes experiments, or actually initially proposes hypotheses given a particular goal, then proposes experiments to test those hypotheses, and closes the loop, including with a system that analyzes the output of those experiments. If you're interested, I'll direct you to the preprint to see the kind of research that Robin can do. It can certainly do kind of incremental research, but the kind of extremely complex multi-hop research that talented human scientists can do is still a very much an open question that I'm not sure we yet know how to tackle. And I guess a corollary to that is once you do make this kind of multi-step reasoning, you eventually come up with a new piece of information, right? You have several steps of reasoning, you propose an experiment, you go and conduct that experiment, and now you know something about the world that you didn't know before. Eventually, that has to be put back into your scientific theory. And this is something that we also still don't very well understand how to do in an unstructured way. There's certainly work in this space in like things like Bayesian experiment design, where if your kind of your design space is very well structured, we understand how to update our posteriors, but it's not super clear how to do things like go from observing that a mutation in a particular gene is linked to familial Parkinson's, gives us the clue that protein misfolding is linked to or can cause neurodegeneration. Or to take an extreme example, the fact that we know that DNA is a heritable, the observation that DNA leads to protein synthesis and is linked to heritability was originally the thing that eventually moved scientists away from thinking that proteins are the fundamental unit of genetic information to DNA. Most AI systems do their theory updates kind of over there at that leftmost level, where individual mechanisms or systems can be updated, but it's still an open question of how we get all the way over here, besides, let's say, retraining our priors on a large corpus of data. So that basically brings me to my end. I have one last closing thought, which, to echo what I started with, AI systems are already in use across pretty much all parts of the scientific method, and probably across most domains, at least certainly all domains I've worked in. Historically, the scientific method has co-evolved with the tools used by scientists. This has been true with the advent of computing, with the advent of large-scale distributed computing, and probably stretching back decades and centuries. And so it's maybe an important question to ask what this next step of co-evolution looks like as we develop new tools that enable us to work differently. And should we be designing AI systems with this kind of paradigm shift in mind? I'll point out that maybe this kind of paradigm shift was coming regardless of the advent of AI or not. The number of publications has been growing exponentially. The amount of information that's available has been growing exponentially. And the systems we study maybe don't grow exponentially, but we're certainly getting higher and higher resolution to the point where it is difficult for a single human researcher to understand everything in the domain that they're working in. And so AI is a very useful tool to be able to deal with this explosion, and I'm pretty excited to see how that pans out.